Good morning again. This is our fourth and final installment on the book of Ecclesiastes. Just a quick reminder, quick summary in case you haven't been joining us all along. We've been looking at the book of Ecclesiastes and asking the question, how should we live? What kind of things should we do and why should we do them in the face of uncertainty, in the face of life that sometimes seems to be beyond our control, beyond our prediction, that can be overwhelming. So, in the very beginning, we looked at the book of Proverbs, and I argued that Proverbs presents a very black and white account of the way things are. That if you follow the way of wisdom, which is very easy to do, if you learn it, if you master it, if you follow it, then you will achieve success. Then you will have long life and prosperity, and things will go well for you. However, if you turn your back on wisdom and fall into folly, which involves turning away from the path, then you will have trouble. Then your plans will not succeed. And the argument that I made was that Proverbs is a very optimistic and very practical book that presents this black and white way to live. And that Ecclesiastes, so that's sort of like how we teach our children. This is in the realm of don't touch the stove, study hard, be nice to your elders, clean your room, right? Work, tell the truth, right? These are basic bits of wisdom that we have learned, that we teach our children, and that function in a very black and white way when we're teaching young people. Ecclesiastes is the kind of realization that people make as they move into and out of adolescence and into young adulthood, which is a realization that things are not always so clear-cut, that life is not always divided into clear binaries of good and bad, of what wisdom and foolishness, of righteousness and wickedness, and that sometimes when we work hard, the hard work that we have doesn't pay off. Or sometimes when we're having prosperity, it can very quickly turn to adversity without any kind of warning and without any kind of explanation, certainly due to no fault of our own. And that, in fact, the world is a little bit confusing. And the argument that I made was that Ecclesiastes suggests that we have to do two things, two very important things. First, recognize that everything is hevel, everything in the world is fleeting, that human life is fleeting, that everything that we do comes and goes and it's beyond our control. And so therefore that puts a special burden of sacredness, a special significance to each moment in which we live. And then furthermore, if it is true that things are beyond our control, if ultimately the future is unknowable to us, then we have to find a way to discover meaning and significance and value in the work that we do. That if there are no guarantees of success, despite what Proverbs says, if there are no guarantees that things will go well, of reward, of return on our work, on our toil, then we must find value and meaning in the work itself. And maybe there will come good things out of it, and maybe not. But that is out of our control. That is in the hands of God, as Ecclesiastes says. And so at the end of last time, we asked the question, not only what are you doing, but why are you doing it? And that you should think about the inherent value and significance of the work that you do, no matter the context that you're in, no matter whether it's going to lead to any kind of outcome or reward, and even no matter whether it is work that is associated with joy and prosperity and happiness, or work that is associated with struggle and even pain and frustration and sorrow, grief, right? That we can find significance in that work. Well, today we're going to finish up the book, and I'm going to look at a couple of important high-level passages in the book. And the question that we're asking ourselves today, so in week 2 we ask ourselves, what is going on right now around you? And then in last week we talked about what are you doing and why are you doing it? And then today the question we're asking is, what are we called to do? What time is it? Here in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 7, he says, look, whatever your hand finds to do, do with your might, because there's no work or anything once you're gone. So here you are, you might as well, no matter what your hand finds to do with your might. But that still leaves open the question, what are we supposed to do? I think especially in this time of quarantine, in this time of just disruption, this is a question that has plagued a lot of us. What are we supposed to be doing? Some of us were suddenly blessed with copious amounts of unstructured time. How should we spend our time? In the time that we would normally go to conferences or go on trips or go into the office, suddenly we have time. What do we do with it? How can that time be meaningful? How can we use that time productively in a way that isn't just letting it slip through our fingers? And I think that it raises the question, especially like with my children who are teenagers, what are they supposed to be doing? They're very content to just fall into their screens, fall into their games, fall into their videos, fall into their chats and things like this they like to do. And that has value, I think. But what are the larger things that they are called to do as young men, in my boy's case? What are we supposed to be doing? Well, this brings us to chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes, which is the very famous passage that is quoted in the Birds song, "For everything there's a season, turn, turn, turn." And in the song, which you probably remember, they say that, there's a time for this and a time for that, a time for this and a time for that. And then he says there's a time for war and a time for peace. And the song wants us to believe that it's not too late for peace. The song is basically a call for peace in the midst of the Vietnam War. Well, the text itself here in Ecclesiastes 3 is a little different from the song in one very important way. Take a look at this just for a second. He says that for everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant, to pluck up, to kill, to heal, to break down, to build up, to weep, to laugh, to mourn, to dance, etc. These feel like verbs. They feel like things that we do, that we decide, that we have power over. You can decide, according to the Birds, turn, turn, turn. I'm done with war. Now I choose peace. Well, that would be nice, but we've learned enough of Ecclesiastes to know that that's not generally Ecclesiastes' worldview. You're not choosing the things that come to you. Rather, your hand finds them. Look at this first pair. A time to be born and a time to die. Now, nobody chooses when they're going to be born. Nobody chooses that. You're hanging out in the womb, you're just doing your business, and then all of a sudden, here are contractions. All of a sudden, you are pushed, physically pushed out into the world. And it's traumatic. It's not a transition that is very easy, really, for anybody. Well, if you're in the womb and it is time to be born, what should you do? What is in front of you? What should you be doing? And the answer is being born. The best thing you can do in that moment is go with the thing that's happening. Well, that makes a certain kind of obvious sense. Being born is not a choice that we're making. What if the same thing were true of a time to die? How would we feel looking at the end of life in the same way that we look at the beginning of life? Meaning, we're doing our thing, we're here, and then all of a sudden, we are being physically pushed into the next world, physically pushed into whatever is out there. And it has as many unknowns as the physical world has to the baby in the womb, and it is potentially traumatic. But the one thing that you can't do, whether you are a baby in the womb or a person who has come to the end of their life, is you cannot go any further. You don't have any more choices to make. Now, I recognize that the end of life does involve choices. There are some cases in which people choose to end their life. That's a separate issue and a very delicate, sensitive issue. I'm not talking about that. And there are cases where we have to make really hard decisions about the end of life, right? End of life ethics and end of life reflection is a very powerful and important reflection conversation we have to have about, well, if I find myself in this situation, here are the medical interventions I would like. Here are the ones that I would prefer not to go through. Here are the various odds and the various treatments or whatever, and here are the choices we are making. That does involve a certain amount of agency. I'm not denying that. I'm talking about that moment of the cessation of life is something that happens to us, that happens to all of us. And it has a kind of natural progression and a kind of natural belonging that being born also has. That this is part of the cycle, a time to be born and a time to die. We don't choose either of those. What if we don't choose the others either here? A time to plant, a time to pluck up. Well, this is the metaphor of the season. Whatever your hand finds to do, what does your hand find to do in the spring? What does your hand find to do in the fall? In the spring, we plant, and in the fall, we harvest. You're not going to get very far if you reverse it and you decide to plant in the fall, with the exception of, I don't know, maybe cabbages. You follow the time. You look and you ask yourself, what time is it? What has presented itself to me? And that is the thing that I should get busy doing and being. So in a way, these are nouns, right? There's a time of birthing and a time of dying, a time of planting, a time of harvesting. We don't choose those times, but we find ourselves in those times. And the best response, according to Ecclesiastes, the one that has the most likelihood of finding success is to identify what time it is and act in ways that are according to that time. That's whatever our hand finds to do. Well, there are other questions here, a time of killing and a time of healing. Well, is there a time of killing? That's a difficult question. But again, the question is not, do I choose to kill or not? But what is it that I am called to do? What is it that I am now in the midst of? Now, I don't know. I reject sort of killing across the board, but I just want to point out that there is a very vigorous ethical, moral debate about various elements of life that might involve the taking of life. That doesn't involve only killing of humans. It could be involve killing of animals or having things having to do with shaping the environment, right? What is it we are called to do, and how do we respond appropriately? That's very different than seeing yourself as the agent, as the power in the world, choosing to go out and dominate. That's a very different kind of situation. Certainly, the other ones I think are a little easier. This time to kill is the one that really trips me up. But a time of weeping and a time of laughing. I mean, it's just obvious. When it is a time of weeping, this is something that happens to you, and now you're weeping. I have found that sometimes weeping and laughing really go together. That sometimes we respond to grief with humor, and that's perfectly okay too. A time of mourning and dancing, embracing and refraining from embracing, seeking and losing, tearing and sowing, being silent and speaking. I think that that's a pretty powerful idea in our modern context in terms of with things that are going on, or if somebody tells you something, or you know that there's a particular issue that's gripping your community. When is it time to speak? When is your voice needed? And when is it time to refrain from speaking? That is one of the things that shows wisdom more than anything else, don't you think? Where you sometimes see an interview or you're talking to someone you know and they just feel the need to say something when what they really need to do is to be quiet and to listen. So I think that this poem is definitely worth reflecting on. And it's meant to be a poem. It's not systematic theology. We don't have to parse out every single one of these. It is meant to be inspirational. It is meant to be poetic. And so I think reflecting on it, not making too much out of the individual bits and pieces, but rather seeing it as part of a description of a larger dynamic in our lives, a larger dynamic in the world, which is that we enter into the day, we enter into a room, we open our eyes in the morning, and here is the time. Here is what we have found, and now we must identify the right and appropriate response, the thing to do, given the time that we have found ourselves in. I'm going to turn now to chapter 12 in the book as we finish up. And the first paragraph in chapter 12 is kind of difficult if you tried to read through it. It's almost apocalyptic imagery, almost like end of the world imagery. And there's a lot of debate about the nature of this imagery. They're talking about the sun and the moon being darkened, right? This sounds like, Mark or Revelation or other kind of apocalyptic description. I think the point is here at the end of the paragraph, he says, look, in the end, life is coming to a close. Industry has stopped. The dust returns to the earth, and life returns to God who gave it, and everything is hevel. I think he's saying that hevel, the fleeting, ephemeral, slippery, vapor-like nature of reality, is not only apply to human lives, but really applies to the creation as a whole. And that we are part of a creation that has a kind of transience built into it. There's a kind of hevel quality, an ephemeral, a vapor-like quality to existence itself, that in the end, all of this will cease and all of life will return to the God who gave it. And that is a kind of a hopeful affirmation for something beyond this physical plane that is a little different from earlier where he says, well, look, we don't know what's coming after we die. Here, it's not a specific description of afterlife, but rather a simple affirmation. And I think it's a helpful one in the midst of all of our uncertainties in the modern day. This is a simple affirmation, which is that all of life, everything that is, all of the creation, both human life and human breath, the lives and the breath of all the creatures and organisms that are in the world, and indeed the world itself, all of us together are in the hands of God. We can't know what's coming. We can't predict the future. We can't control what has come before or after. But in the face of this uncertainty, we know that God has given us the ability to find meaning and purpose in the things that happen to us along the way. And we affirm that in the end, all of life and all of creation is in the hands of God and will return to the God who made it. That I find to be, myself, a comforting idea. That just because things are hevel, just because things are out of our control or impossible to fully grasp or understand, does not mean that reality is just random. It doesn't mean that things are just come and go, and never go anywhere. That there is a cessation. There is an end. There is a goal, some way that we're moving, even if we don't know what that is. And that way is in our return to God. Now, I have described Ecclesiastes over the last 3 to 4 weeks in ways that I hope invite you to find meaning and significance and value in those words. I started my discussion by pointing out how biblical translations really do a bad job with hevel. And when they translate hevel as meaningless or pointless or futile, then they have given up on the book. I think they have turned their back on this very deep, potentially confusing, but valuable lesson in the book, and have just said, well, hey, this is just pessimistic. We don't need to worry about that. I find that to be very, very problematic. And as a scholar who's trying to understand the Bible, it's offensive to me. So I invite you to read these texts as scripture, to find in them valuable and meaningful communication from God to you. The end of the book, starting here in verse 9, is a little editorial addition at the end, in which whoever it was that brought this text into the canon added a little thing at the end, which basically says, look, this is a hard book. Don't let it freak you out too much. They say, besides being wise, the teacher taught people lots of things. He was trying to do the best he could, right? He sought to find pleasing words, and he wrote words of truth plainly. That is the goal, that is the essence of the hope of every teacher in the world, to find words of truth that they can communicate clearly and plainly. And then they say, look, wise sayings, wisdom literature are like goads. They're like little things that give you poke. They poke you out of complacency. They poke you out of a sense of, okay, I've got everything figured out. And by poking you, they make you take a fresh look, like, oh, wait a minute, wait a minute, what's happened here? You take a fresh reevaluation of your life, a reevaluation of the world, because these wise sayings are giving you a little push. However, they say, look, don't go too far with it. Beware. Of the making of many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Amen, brother. Right? You can throw yourself into this in a way where you just sort of lose perspective. And then they end with, I think, is a kind of affirmation of the traditional, more orthodox viewpoint. Look, they say, once we've said everything we need to say, once we've wrestled with this book, just remember this. Fear God, keep his commandments. That's what everybody's supposed to do. God will bring everything into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. Now, in the book, the author of Ecclesiastes specifically calls these things into question. Specifically says, do we know what it looks like to really fear God in this world? Are we sure that God brings everything into judgment? Are we sure that everything will find its reward in the end? Are we sure about that? And the editors who are bringing this into the Bible say, well, we think it's very valuable. This is my interpretation of their thought process. We think it's very valuable to go through this wrestling, go through this struggling in the context of the larger truth, which is that we can trust God, we need to follow God, and all things being equal, we should try to fear God and keep his commandments, even while we are doing all of this wrestling, even while we are dealing with all these questions. And for a lot of years, I saw the end of Ecclesiastes as a kind of, a cop-out. They wimped out at the end. They're like trying to put a little bit of something at the end that undercut everything that the teacher was saying. I see it a little different now. I think that the editors are trying to, in the face of a tradition that can be overwhelming, the editors are opening up a little bit of space. They're giving us a little bit of space to ask questions, to wrestle, and to struggle, but in a way that is secure within a larger affirmation of God's goodness, within a larger commitment to the covenant, within a larger commitment to serving God. To me, that's a beautiful place to be, and I hope that in this process you have been invited to this journey, to combine a sense of commitment to God and fear of God and service of God with a very honest, clear-eyed description of the world as it is in all of its ambiguity, in all of its frustration and pain, and really confess that even though there are things that we affirm, there's a lot of things that we don't know. Thank you again for having me as part of this, and I look forward to seeing you again in person next year, hopefully, or somewhere down the line. And let me know, send me an email if you have questions or comments about the work that we've done in this series, and God bless you.